Today's episode is sponsored by Jung Seed Company. Jung Seed Company has the largest selection of annual and perennial flowers and plants online. They are a family-owned and operated company since 1907. Use code 15FG podcast to receive 15% off your order at jungseed.com. That's JUNGSEED.com. Hello and welcome to another episode of Let's Argue About Plants, the podcast for people who love plants.
But not always the same ones. I'm Carol Collins. I am a senior editor at Fine Gardening magazine.
Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
Only took, 10 years? But this is the first time I've ever actually said that out loud.
Yay, and congratulations to you. Well deserved. And I am Danielle Sherry. I'm still the executive editor, chief cook, and dishwasher here at Fine Gardening, and podcaster. So today, very exciting, we're going to be talking about deer-resistant plants. And I feel like it's a topic that we've covered a little here, a little there, all the time. Always a very popular topic because most of the country, in some way, shape, or form, in some species or form, deals with deer. Carol, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is your deer issue in your yard?
10 being the worst?
Yes.
Yeah, like 10.
Oh, she's not sugarcoating it today, folks.
I have a deer trail that goes right through my garden, and they take detours for the more delicious parts of my garden. So yeah, they're there all the time, pretty much every day. How about you? Do you have deer?
Well,
like
so
that?
I live super rurally. Like, I live on a very, very wooded lot. So I would say that I am probably an 8.5, 9. And it's because we have a huge active deer population. But because there's so much natural environment, like, I am not in a suburban neighborhood by any stretch of the imagination. So I feel like I stand a bit more of a chance because, yes, there's tons of them and they're around, but there's a lot of natural environment that they tend to stick to unless there's times of extreme pressure. As in right now, as we hurtle towards winter and things are just starting to get mowed down left and right in my gardens, and it's very depressing. But over the years, I feel like, yes, there's sprays, and I'm sorry, but I have a bigger property. It's not economically feasible for me to do fencing and to fence in every portion of my property. Wouldn't be able to do that. I have a dog. She's very vocal at them. So all of these things, I've done all these things over the years to, mitigate as best I can. But really, at the end of the day, I think the thing that you have to really lean into if you have deer pressure is these deer-resistant plants. But I think you should probably go into, what do we mean by deer-resistant? Does that mean deer-proof?
Oh, there is no such thing as a deer-proof plant. And really, you can have something growing for literally a decade and they don't touch it. And then one spring, some fawn is like, hey, let's try this, and everyone's like, hey, this is my new favorite now. It's just, there's really no predicting what it is they're gonna go for. I'll tell you one thing that is not deer resistant, and that's dahlias. They have come through and bitten the heads off every single one of my plants, and I've had those growing outside the deer fence for years, but it's never been this bad.
Oh, yeah. And it really, all sorts of factors, right? Environmental pressures. Have we gone through a drought, situation? Are we, expecting, poor winter weather early? They tend to get a little frenzied and frantic in that regard. What is the natural predators scenario? We have a lot of friends and gardeners that are out in the Mountain West. Are there natural predators that are taking out the deer and stomping down that population. But you're right. You can lean into certain things, right? There tends to be, they always say the nasty plants, right? The stinky plants, this plants with, any sort of like fuzzy, crazy texture to them. Spines are a good thing. A limited amount of toxicity to it. I mean, I know that sounds absolutely awful to people, and especially, if you have pets or small children that like to eat things in your garden, that's probably not the best idea. But, nothing's foolproof. But if you lean into those tenets, a lot of times you can at least get away with certain plants being less desirable than, a hosta. Right up front.
And most plants can take a little bit of browsing. That's the bottom line. And if they can't, then, like put those inside a fence or maybe not grow them. But it's an ongoing struggle for a lot of people, isn't it?
It definitely is. It definitely is. Well, all right. So instead of falling into the doldrums of depression right now, let's talk about a few things that have worked, given that you're a 10 on the deer pressure scale and I am an 8.5, 9. What was the first thing that sprung to mind that has been successful for you for a deer-resistant plant?
So one thing that I have grown that deer have absolutely never touched is lavender. And that's on this, you could call it stinky. I love that smell, but the deer absolutely do not. And this year I tried growing lavender from seed. So John Sheeper's Kitchen Garden Seeds, they send us free seed samples every year. And I would never, ever have tried growing lavender from seed, but they sent seeds for free, so I had to try it.
Of course you did.
Yeah. So the variety that they sent is called Elegance Purple, and it's elegance is spelled a funny way. It's ELLA, like the person's first name, Elegance. So I'm imagining there's somebody named Ella that was maybe involved somehow with the development of this lavender. It's a Lavandula augustifolia cultivar, and it is perennial, so it's perennial in zones 5 to 7, and like all lavenders, it likes full sun, well-drained soil, avoiding winter wet if you can, and it's stays nice and small, like 12 to 14 inches tall and wide, bushy, compact plant, good branching. So if you plant this one early enough, you can get it to flower in the first year. And I did. It worked.
Nice.
Yeah, super cool. And it has these beautiful bluish purple flowers that come from like really dark purple buds. So you usually see the buds and the flowers at the same time. There's a real nice pop of color in the landscape. And then it has those silvery stems and leaves, which I think also is a bit of a deer deterrent. They don't like the silvery foliage as much, although they've eaten a few other silvery plants of mine, but not this one. And the flowers are edible. You can use them as garnishes on, sweets or savory things. And you can also use sprigs of the foliage. Like you drop that into a cup of lemonade or a cocktail and it just sort of elevates it to like a new Mediterranean flavored. Very cool. So if you want to start these indoors, you've got to do it like 8 to 10 weeks before your last frost. And that's on the very early side of when you would be starting seeds. But the seedlings are very small and they take a long time to get going. So the John Sheeper's instructions, which I followed, say that you plant them in sterile mix. You don't want to have damping off. And so you use a sterile seed starting mix that's designed for that purpose. You wet it very slightly, you sow the seeds shallowly on the surface, and then cover it with plastic wrap. And don't water it again until the sprouts emerge. Okay. And I did that. It took them a while, but they did emerge. And then you can start watering it like normal. But, it's just not a good idea to let them get too wet. Because they can have fungal problems really when they're very young. But what's neat is you can start your seeds all in the same pot and then you move them out when they're big enough to handle. But when they are even like, a half an inch or a quarter inch tall, these seedlings smell like lavender. So it's just an absolute joy to pot these out. It feels like, you're smelling summer, even though it's, raining gray, icy porridge outside. Yeah. So, you set them out after the danger of last frost, and I've other places besides Sheepers sell this. The Johnny's instructions say that in late fall, around now, you want to cut the top growth back to below where the flower stems are, and then mulch it really well to help it get through the winter. Okay. So I think I'll try that. I've never mulched my other lavenders, but when you grow something from seed, you've got a lot invested. So right. I think I might. Yeah.
This has been a journey.
Yes. Might actually mulch it.
So, what do they list as the actual? Because lavenders can be, especially a lot of people get very excited about the Spanish lavenders, but those aren't particularly hardy for us here. What were the zonal ranges on Ella?
They say zones 5 to 7.
Okay.
So, and that's a kind of a narrow band, but I do imagine that, certain parts of zone 8, even zone 9, you might be able to grow it. You just have to be more careful about making sure that maybe it needs, I don't know, maybe a little shade in the afternoon. I'm not sure, but 5 to 7 is the sweet spot for this one.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, no winter wet for lavender. Winter wet is a bad thing for lavender. And I'll add just that you turned me on years ago to lavender is easy to propagate from cutting. So once you have started it and made the investment from the new cool variety from seed, doing some cuttings, a little bit of rooting hormone earlier in the spring or even in the winter. I know that you do that as gifts in the holiday season. They really do root very easily, and I was the recipient of some of your cuttings, and then I took cuttings from the cuttings, and now I've got a pretty good lavender population, which the deer do not touch. So that is a really, really good way to kick off the episode. Do you, when we get a topic and we're getting ready, do you just walk around your garden and go, oh, okay, that would be a good contender for this episode?
This one in particular, because, there's nothing that's deer proof, but now I have been gardening the same spot for 15 years. So I'm like, what have they never touched? But I took a walk around the neighborhood too, because, nice. A lot of my deer-proof plants, I have talked about before on the podcast. Because it's really kind of what I can grow.
Well, yeah. And, they're not just, it's not just that they're deer-proof. It's that they, they have great spring blooms or blah, blah, blah. Yes, I understand. Well, that's what I generally do just to start to jog my memory a little bit. And I was just away for a bit, and obviously, when you're not around and active in your garden, the deer tend to say, oh, great, she's on vacation. Let me come and just help myself. So I got to see a lot of damage that had happened, especially now that we're at this precipice of, cooler weather is setting in. And I really do feel like they start to get frenzied and fatten themselves up as best as possible for the upcoming winter season. But one thing that they didn't touch, which I'm very excited about, which was a native plant that has made an introduction into my garden, is swamp aster, which is Symphyiotrochum panaceum, and that's zones 3 to 9. And it was the one bright spot coming home when a lot of other things had started to die because it's late fall, or had been really browsed by the deer because we hadn't been around. And the swamp aster is just in full bloom right now, absolutely beautiful, on its way out the door, but one of those last pollinator plants that really puts on a show in my garden. It is that standard aster-like flower, so it is a very light and airy daisy approach, look to it. It kind of goes from they sometimes say white and lavender is the flower color, but they basically age out, right? So they come out as kind of a lilac lavender with a really pretty little boss of, yellow in the middle, and then kind of bleach out and fade out as they age more towards the white. But you kind of get this, on the same plant, this variation of, light lavender all the way into white, and it's really, really beautiful. Now, okay, so it's called swamp aster, so you can figure like the conditions that it likes. Full sun to partial shade with wet or very moist soils. So, in this area of my property where there's a lot of wetlands and, tends to get flooded out, this plant does really, really well. It gets 6 to 8 feet tall, and that is not an inaccurate description, because I'm 5'3" and this plant towers over me. So, given ideal conditions, it will reach that max level, and only about 2 to 3 feet wide. It's great for naturalized areas. It easily self-sows, but like a lot of asters, native asters do, but very easily removed. Also, if you've got it in a more manicured setting and you're not really into the meadowy look, you could always deadhead it after the flowers go by, and you'll, really stomp down on that self-seeding. But in this area, there is jewelweed. I have some rhododendrons. I have some white pines. Let's see, what else do I have down in that area? And the deer eat everything else around this aster, but don't touch the aster. Now, this has been the case for the past several years. Is that going to be the case next year? I have no idea. I might have to come back onto this podcast and say, it will do the topic, deer love these plants, and I'll put this on there. But for right now, swamp aster really does, hold up against severe deer pressure. I mean, we're talking everything around it looks like it's been mowed down except for this aster. And again, that swamp aster, it's native to the eastern United States, kind of the eastern half of the United States, and zones 3 to 9. It's a monster, but it's absolutely beautiful. Okie dokie. So moving right along onto things for today that the deer won't eat. That's what I feel like we should do. Today, the deer didn't eat this. What was next on your list, Carol?
So this next one, I think I may have talked about it before, but I saw it recently in my travels this summer. So it brought it back to mind. And that is elegant feather dog fennel. That's a eupatorium. It's Eupatorium capillifolium, elegant feather, zone 6 to 9. And it grows 3 to 6 feet tall, 1 to 3 feet wide. So it's a perennial, but it has like this shrub-like habit and size. But the texture is really softer than most shrubs. So it likes full sun to partial shade, prefers a little afternoon shade in hotter zones, but it is decidedly unfussy about soil. So as long as it's reasonably well drained, it'll adapt to almost any kind of soil. And the straight species is a North American native with a reputation for being kind of weedy. So you can't say invasive because it's native, but it's
robust, obnoxiously robust.
I may or may not have referred to it as a ditchweed in a previous episode because it grows by the side of the road, like kind of throughout the South, Florida all the way over to Texas, and then like up as far north as like Missouri, so like sort of the midline. Yeah, so if you had the straight species, it could be a problem because it really reseeds quite readily. The thing with elegant feather is that it is reportedly a sterile cultivar. So you can get the look of dog fennel without having like a gazillion seedlings if you don't deadhead it in the fall. So elegant feather, that should hopefully, that should cut down on the concerns about the boisterous spreading. But it's, it is got this great texture, so very feathery, elegant, I guess, also. It looks like asparagus fern, kind of. And it's a lovely soft green. And where I saw it, so I was in Indiana, southeast of Indianapolis, and I was at Irvin Etienne's garden, which he has a lot of tropicals and sort of high impact perennials and woodies. And he added this, I think, just within the past year. And it looks great. It looks great with the burgundy foliage of, some of his plants. It looks good with those big, broad-leafed, tropical, looking plants. It's another flavor, if you will. Yeah. It's another texture that really is quite unlike most of the rest of the plants that you would have in your garden. This may need some extra mulch for winter protection in colder parts of the zone. So I think Irvin is in zone 5 or 6, but compared to some of the other stuff that he overwinters, this one is pretty hardy, and it should be pretty hardy for most of us. So, the common name, dog fennel, comes from what is described by most sources as an unpleasant scent when you crush the leaves. So that's the key to the deer resistance. Like, deer really will not bother this plant. And I suspect if you put it around some plants that are a little more vulnerable to the deer, that it might have a little bit of protective value because of its stinkiness. So
does it stink like black licorice? Because I'm thinking fennel. I know that's its common name. That's not its botanical name. Does it smell like? Does it have that heavy anise smell?
I should have sniffed the plant that was in her. I don't know, but I'm guessing it's something like that, like an herbal smell. But yeah. I don't find anise to be objectionable, and like everybody that describes the scent of this says that it's unpleasant. So
yeah, I think it's do you like to eat black licorice?
I love it.
See, so that's why you don't find it objectionable. I smell anise. I hate black licorice, and I'm like, ugh. So if I was a deer, I would stay away from dog fennel if it in fact smells like fennel, because that's a very pungent smell. So yeah. Interesting. So give me zones again, Carol, because I'm taking notes as we do this too, because I need to up my deer resistance game.
Zone 6 to 9.
Oh, okay. All right. But Irvin gets away with it. Now, when he overwinters, is he bringing in for an overwinter? Does he overwinter it in place even though he's on that borderline of zone 5?
He brings a lot of things in. I don't think he's going to bring this one in. Okay. And he leaves a lot in the ground. His secret, he is a rabbit farmer. He has rabbits, and so the wood shavings that he uses for bedding that get impregnated with rabbit waste, that's his mulch. Okay. And it seems to work really well. He overwinters things in the ground that I don't think most people in his zone would be trying. So the mulch, hey, if you could get your hands on some rabbit bedding,
there you go. Yeah,
there you go. That
or even just good. Trying to like mulch the crowns. Like for years we've talked about like gunnera. We're right on the cusp with gunnera, but if you mulch the crowns a bit and then make sure you're taking it off before it rots in the winter or in the spring, maybe that's applicable for people who are on that zonal boundary for that. So yeah. I love it. Well, hey, shocker of all shockers, I'm going to talk about an annual. I don't think that's ever happened on this podcast.
Oh, that would usually be me.
Yes, exactly. Well, listen, so I was looking for, I feel like in the spring you look for problem-solving plants. You take stock of, all right, what died? Where's there a hole? What do you need more of? And for me, it's knitter plants. I've got fairly extensive beds that go from full sun to full shade, and I've worked for a gardening magazine for going on 19 years now. So I have a lot of onesie-itis, a lot of things that were sent to us as just, trial plants and such. And I've struggled the last several years of bringing some cohesiveness to this kind of crazy botanical garden that I've got going on and making it more like a beautiful landscape instead of just sore thumbs every few feet. So I'm looking for knitter plants, and annuals are great for that. Some sort of self-sower I really wanted. I was hoping to get more into the natives for the self-sower. So I settled on, from this native wildflower seed source, slender-leaved false foxglove. Okay, it's Anagallis tenuifolia, and it's native to Central and Eastern North America. So basically half the country. Divide the country in half, and everything to the east it's native as. And it's just this serendipitous, cute, adorable, not a lot of inputs, because we know A, I'm not a huge seed sower unless it's the vegetable garden, and B, I'm not a big annual person. But this was something that I could direct sow. Prior to, I sowed it in winter of last year, or, late fall, early winter of last year. It went through its own stratification process without me even knowing, in the beds. And then the next spring, it started popping up. Now, I will say, I'm pretty sure I weeded out a lot of what I planted until realizing, oh, you know what? Shoot. That I actually planted that. So then I went back and left what was in place and was starting to sprout. And this ended up being the most adorable little wildflower that really started to come into its own blooming wise in late summer. In the meantime, the foliage is, kind of feathery. It reminded me a lot of that annual fairy lights Linaria, which can be a little aggressive and not great. So this is a good alternative to that. But this very needly flax-like, plant with this beautiful little, foxglove-like flower. These little, throated tubes that are tiny, maybe the size of a pinky nail, in bright, bright purple, almost on the magenta side, and then this little kind of whitish throat with spots on it. Started blooming in late summer. And definitely, kind of filled in here or there, because it takes, being that it's a native wildflower, it took everything from in the full sun bed all the way reaching into partial to maybe not full shade, but a more shady bed on the other side of my house. It naturalizes in its native environment into sunny meadows and coastal shorelines. So, where I am, which is more in coastal Connecticut, it just kind of had that, more coastally feel to it. I just adore the flowers that, like I said, they look like a foxglove. Yes. So, slender-leaved false foxglove for its common name, but maybe more accurate, maybe like a little snapdragon, or angelonia, which is a super popular annual that we all plant that's not native. Very similar to that. And overall, I probably should give you guys how big this gets. This is not a big plant. This is probably it peaks out at around 12 inches tall and about maybe 6 to 8 inches wide. It's a fairly small plant that just kind of dots in. But if you're somebody who's into tall verbena, like Verbena bonariensis, something like that, in the similar vein as that. And here's the other thing. It's a host and nectar plant for the common buckeye butterfly. So it's the plant that keeps on giving, right? So the caterpillars do their bit and, chomp here and there on it as a host for the larva. And then the butterflies hatch and stick around and stay in the environment because it's a good nectar plant for that butterfly as well. I really dig it. It was just a newbie. It was a new trial plant. And it completely filled the niche that I was looking for. And I think it would have done even better as a knitter plant had I not weeded it out in the spring and just let it do its thing. But so that's slender-leaved foxglove. It's an annual. I'm gonna get more seed this year, but I'm hoping that it also, because it is known to self-sow, and I did let the flowers go to seed. So we're going to see what happens, and I'll report back. But the other good thing is the deer didn't touch it. And it's everywhere in all of my beds. and they haven't touched it. And I honestly just think like they can't be bothered. Like it's a tiny plant. It's really needle-like. Like there's just nothing really to like, why are they going to waste their time? It's not even worth like the energy of like munching their jaw up and down to munch on this plant. That is completely, editorialized by me. I did not interview the deer to get their opinion, but that's what I'm thinking. All right, Carol, we haven't talked about any woody plants. Do you have any woody plants on your list?
It just so happens that I do. It does. So, and this is the one I took a walk around my neighborhood because, I figured I'd branch out and see what the neighbors had. And I am not 100% sure on the ID for my neighbor's plant. So what I think they have is Thunderhead Japanese black pine. But in the show notes, I went into the Fine Gardening archive and got a photo that I know is Thunderhead. But it's a pretty distinctive black pine. It's got a beautiful habit that really, like, there isn't much else that looks like it. So it's a Japanese black pine, which is Pinus thunbergii, Thunderhead, hardy from zones 5 to 8. And pines, I thought, are quite deer resistant. But when you mentioned the spot that has white pine, and you say they eat that.
They do. I like. Yeah, particularly in the spring when they're candling. Yes. I think it's a lot more of a tender shoot that they'll nip back. So then it ends up looking like it got this terrible haircut in the spring. But yeah, I spring especially. I just go for my native eastern white pine.
Yes, and new growth, like that is one where even a species that they will generally avoid, they'll take that delicate little new growth off from it. Just like, I guess it doesn't taste as strong or have the texture. But I really have never noticed the deer bothering my neighbor's Thunderhead. So I'm hoping, like, and it does seem to have a coarser texture, like a more prickly texture than our native white pine. It's got a bit darker color, which is great visually. I don't know if that has any effect on whether the deer eat it. The other thing is that it gets fairly large, and at that point the deer can't reach. So it gets like 15 feet tall and wide over time, although in the first 10 years, maybe 5.5 to 6 feet tall and wide. So maybe after it gets up past the point where their little snouts can reach it, the deer just can't bother, the shape of it that much. Yeah. But the habit, I think thundercloud is a great name for this because the ends of the branches have this sort of almost like cloud-like appearance, and they sort of pile on each other like a big storm cloud. So it's just, if some people will prune it to make it look like kind of bonsai-ish.
Yeah, that's what I was envisioning in my head.
Yes, and you often see it in botanical gardens or whatever, where they've cleaned out the lower branches, and it really does look like sort of a larger bonsai. My neighbors just let theirs do what it does, and I think that is fabulous. I prefer it. And if the deer eat a little, then there's less to lose.
Right, it's not as manicured looking.
Yeah. But I mean, even if they nip a few candles, like they will not destroy the tree. It may affect the shape of it for that season, but they won't eat the whole thing. Little stinkers. But I think the main thing with this was just to give it enough space, because eventually I think 15 feet is probably conservative. I think nothing is truly a dwarf, and over time it may get even bigger. So you just want to plan for that when you install it. And the cool thing that my neighbor did was they put it sort of at the corner of their lot, so it blocks the headlights of the cars driving by, gives them a little bit of screening. But with the irregular shape, it doesn't feel like a hedge or anything. It's just like this, beautiful shape in the landscape that really stands out amidst their other woodies. They have a lot of woodies in their landscape, woodies and perennials. So, yeah. So it's not one that I have yet, but that I would consider, and probably I would do this instead of an eastern white pine cultivar, because it is just, I think, a little bit more deer resistant.
Yeah, it sounds really beautiful. It sounds really beautiful. So we should remind folks, because we are talking about quite a few plants that we haven't talked about before. If you're interested in what these look like, or in my case, me butchering the botanic name, so getting the proper spelling of it, go to our show notes. You're going to want to go to finegardening.com, hit that podcast tab, and we make it super easy. We have all the plant lists there, and we have photos of all the plants that we mention on there, as well as our expert who we have every episode, who's going to give us some really interesting plants that are deer resistant in another area of the country. Okay, so I am glad I prefaced with that, because I'm going to talk about a plant I've never talked about either, and is on my 2025 wish list. Probably the number 1 or number 2 slot. Does everybody do this? Like, they're ranking for what they're going to buy next year. Crazy to do in November, but I'm doing it. It is Daphniphyllum. It has a very kind of colorful and maybe a little insulting common name, also known as redneck rhododendron. I do not prescribe to that. I am not going to call it that, but you will see it listed pretty consistently online under that common name. So Daphniphyllum macropodum, it's zone 7 to 9. 6B, I've seen pretty decent as long as you put it in a protected area. So I'm on the cusp, actually. But this is a really beautiful plant that I saw at Broken Arrow Nurseries this spring. And I immediately was drawn to it in the spring because it looked like a cross between a mountain laurel, a kalmia, and a rhododendron, and from afar it had the shiniest leaves that were these elongated bright green tongues, and all the new growth that it was pushing had the brightest red stems that you've ever seen. And it had an almost tropical appearance, if you will. And I beelined it straight over to this plant and said, oh my gosh, what kind of rhododendron is this? Well, it turns out it's not a rhododendron, completely different genus, but just a beautiful broadleaf evergreen. It's native to China and Japan. It gets about 15 feet tall and wide, and it gets a little bit larger in even warmer climates. So if you're on the, zone 9 end of its range, I imagine this plant is going to, maybe get close to 20 by 20. So a really excellent screening plant, a really excellent option to rhododendron maxi, which is, another very large screening rhododendron. Here's the thing though, immediately, first thing in the description, deer resistant. And apparently it's got, much like a kalmia or a mountain laurel, a little bit of a toxicity to it, and deer tend to leave it alone. Unlike rhododendrons, where deer tend to munch on them right, left, and center, and especially take every single gosh darn flower bud off of your rhododendrons. The plants are dioecious, so they're both female and male are on the same plant. Don't get excited. The flowers are nothing to write home about, allegedly. They're kind of these like nondescript little kind of greeny chartreusey flowers. Fine, whatever. It does its own thing. You don't need to worry about it. This is just going to be a very stately, beautiful broadleaf evergreen in your garden. Despite it being zone 7 to 9, apparently it's also very resistant to winter desiccation, which also rhododendrons are very susceptible to. So this seems like it came from a higher elevation area within, its native range. So perhaps that's why. But it's, these long stalked leathery leaves, and the stalks of the leaves being that bright red that it's just, ooh, Just so beautiful. The new leaves too, when the new leaves start to flush out, they're pink. So, I mean, it just looks like, these little like firecrackers that are spewing out of this plant. I have an area that I do need screening. I feel like when it comes to broadleaf evergreens and screening and that are winter resistant and are deer resistant, there's not a whole lot of choices beyond maybe hollies. So this was something that I really wanted to give a try to this year. So it's Daphniphyllum macropodum, and it's zone 7 to 9. It has a very salty common name that I will not repeat, but you might find it under that if you go looking for it online. All right, Carol, we are spiraling down to our last deer-resistant plant of the season.
Oh, good, the downward spiral section of the podcast.
We are. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. It's, we nobody knows this, but we're going to pull back the curtain. We taped this fairly early in the morning. Both of us have just been traveling pretty nonstop for various different reasons. I feel like I haven't seen Carol in 8 months. So, yes, so we are spiraling downward, but we've got coffee and we're going to end on a high note. What do you got for me?
Okay, so I love smoke bushes. I all the colors, all the shapes. I just love them. So and the deer, I have a bunch, and the deer don't touch them. Nice. So I decided that I would include Purple Supreme Smoke Bush. That's Catinus cogigria, Purple Supreme, zones 4 to 8. The one that I've covered on the podcast before is Royal Purple, which is very similar. Okay. But I have these sort of on my property boundary. So these are great screening. They have this gorgeous leaf color, which is, purple. I don't know if purple is the best description of the leaf color. Mm-hmm. It's like a shimmering, deep burgundy, definitely some purple overtones, with a little bit of a glaucous coating on the leaf. So it's almost like a bit of silver sometimes, especially early in the season. And then when the light comes through from the back side of the leaf, it's almost like an amber color. So a lot of colors besides purple. And it does flower if you let it. But lately, I have been cutting back my smoke bushes in early spring while they are still dormant to get the even better foliage. So if you do a really heavy cutback, it'll push a ton of new growth that has larger leaves, better color on the leaves. And it almost looks like water sprouts that you get on another woody plant, like really just shoots for the sky and covers itself in foliage. So for conditions, you want full sun, moist to dry soil conditions. Again, unfussy about soil, even pH, it doesn't really care. Although I'm sure if you had something really extreme, and if you do, then it might be a little fussy about soil, but it grows pretty much everywhere, and naturally will reach about 15 feet tall and wide. And if you don't cut it back, it can get kind of leggy, so the bottom part maybe doesn't have as much foliage as the top part. But a couple years ago, I started cutting them back because I was working with my girl, Laura Trowbridge, on an article about her garden where she does a lot of cut back shrubs. And so I was like, okay, I'm being a wimp. I'm going to try this. And so I cut it back, and I had all of these branches that looked perfectly good. And what am I going to do with them? So I took some of them and I just shoved them into the ground, pushed them into the ground a couple feet. And we had a very rainy spring that year. I kept them watered in between rains, and by golly, they rooted.
Oh my gosh, it's like hardwood cuttings made easy.
It couldn't have, yes. And I tried it again this year and it didn't work. So I don't think this is like an every year kind of thing, but how cool was that? And suddenly, I doubled my purple supreme population.
Say that 3 times fast.
The first year the foliage was kind of small. They weren't struggling, but they weren't doing fantastic. Year 2, they took off. So they were fully rooted, and the photo in the show notes is one of my plants grown from cuttings in year 2. Great screening plant. This is in sort of what I would describe as my hell strip between the driveway and the road. And I have brightly colored annuals like Mexican sunflower and Benary giants zinnias. So those bright colors really pop against the darker purpley burgundy backdrop. Mm-hmm. So that's cool. I love these plants, and I highly recommend them. There's a golden one called Golden Spirit, which is cool. And again, no deer has touched any of these, even when it's pushing the new growth, even in the spring when there's really not a lot else to eat. They have totally left it alone.
I wonder, I had read many years ago that one of the, the deer resistant qualities of above and beyond, stinkiness and texture and thorns and stuff is plants with milky sap.
Yes.
And Cotinus has milky sap. You
does.
probably know from when you do your pruning, and if you do it a little bit too late, it will bleed and bleed and bleed. So I wonder if that has something to do with it, that milky sap is something
yes.
they just don't dig.
Yeah, and I think that milky sap is very bitter, and actually people, if you are doing cutbacks, be sure to cover your skin, because some people are allergic and will have a sensitive, a dermatological reaction to that milky sap. So that's a good pointer, but on the bright side, I do think you're right that helps keep the deer off from it.
That's so cool, and it's so beautiful, and really, that the coppicing that Laura Trowbridge had done in her, it almost makes the Cotinus look like a tropical plant.
Yeah.
You feel like you're in Costa Rica, when you see these giant foliage, and water sprouts was the perfect description going on in the early spring and into summer. Okay, I'm going to end because I don't feel like I'm surprised. Maybe you did this on purpose because you saw my list, but I figured we were both going to talk a lot about ornamental grasses because all right, we're going to get letters. Okay, here's the thing. There's exceptions to every rule, okay, people? Please don't write me letters, but most ornamental grasses are deer resistant. They are just, it's not their favorite. I don't know why. I mean, I don't think that I would really want to eat a haystack if I had, a hosta to eat instead. Maybe that's why, but I feel like ornamental grasses are pretty much a sure bet, or at least a plant that does, if it does get browsed, will bounce back pretty readily because they have a really extensive root system that's pretty fibrous, and they're naturally occurring plants, a lot of them from North America, that were grazed by herds of buffalo. So, I feel like they can hold up to a little deer nibbling if, it was a plant that originated from a buffalo herd. So I just, I randomly picked one. Random pick was Red October Big Bluestem, and that's Agropogon gerardii Red October, zones 4 to 9. This is actually not a variety of big bluestem that I grow, but I planted it in my friend Jen, shout out to you, Jen, her garden a couple years ago, and was visiting in the fall last year and just said, holy macaroni, that is a gorgeous plant, because it had reached about 5 feet tall. Its max is about 4 to 6 feet tall, 2 to 3 feet wide. And in fall, this was the most beautiful. The upright foliage was purple, red, a little bit of like bronzy copper to it. And it just looked like, smoke rising up out of the garden. Also, I will say that this was stick upright. no flopping whatsoever. That's a big grass for it to have not flopped all over the place, and with the exception of, standing ovation, which is a totally different genera. This is a really tough grass that you really don't have to worry about being a messy, fall all over the place specimen. So obviously, like many ornamental grasses, full sun, dry to medium soil, so some pretty, terrible conditions as far as things are concerned. The blades emerge like a blue-green in summer, kind of a glaucous-y color, but they do have a little bit of a red cast to them. So it's almost a little hint, the plant's giving you a hint of what it's going to do later on in the season. In the fall, they put up some feathery inflorescence. This isn't going to be a grass that gets these gigantic plumes to it. It's more of, a delicate feather, an elegant feather, if you will. And they appear, it's almost wheat-like, it has a very wheat appearance to it. But then that foliage just turns this blazing burgundy purple color as soon as the temperatures start to drop a little bit, and it's a focal point. I feel like there's not a whole ton of grasses that you would say like this is a focal point plant, but this definitely is. She has a partially fenced in yard, so doesn't deal with deer as readily as the rest of us, but they haven't touched it, even though it's kind of outside of the fence line. And I have grown other varieties of big bluestem before, and they have not touched those grasses. So I think that that's a pretty good sign that you could stick to anything within that genus, and it would probably be deer proof. Carol, I think you've grown big bluestem, right? Or have you grown little bluestem?
I have both. I've got standing ovation for the little bluestem, and I have Blackhawks for the big bluestem. And I would have talked about that one, except I can't shut up about that plant. I feel like I've talked about it too much on the podcast. But yeah, that is one. Like you said, that none of my ornamental grasses really have the deer touch. So I also have switchgrass, panicums, and I have never seen anything, even in early spring, from the deer on those. So yeah, it's a nice, and it's a different texture than a lot of the other deer-resistant plants.
Absolutely. So then we ended the episode with giving you 2 whole genera to select from. That's like another extra 200 plants that you can go and look up. So yay. All right. Well, let's see what's coming up next. I know what's coming up next. And now, because everything sounds better with a British accent, here's Peter to talk about deer needing a PR agent. Oh my gosh. All right, here we go.
Today, I'd like to discuss with you, dear listeners, one of the most profound image makeovers in the history of the animal kingdom. A PR transformation so shocking, it makes even reality TV stars blush. I'm talking, of course, about the deer. Now let's rewind the clock to the golden age of Disney, when we were first introduced to that wide-eyed, delicate creature who captured our hearts. Bambi. Remember Bambi? The symbol of innocence, the delicate fawn frolicking through sun-dappled meadows, befriending a rabbit named Thumper, and learning life's lessons while we sobbed into our popcorn buckets. Ah, simpler times. Back then, the deer was a beloved figure. Majestic, gentle, the poster child for wildlife calendars, conservation efforts, and all things wholesome. People used to say, "Oh look, a deer," with joy in their voices and misty eyes. But fast forward to today, "Oh look, a deer," is now said in a tone that suggests the same excitement as finding a raccoon rifling through your trash at 2 a.m. How did it come to this? Well, let's start with one word. Gardens. Yes, my friends, the moment our beloved Bambi wandered into our backyards and mistook our prized roses for an all-you-can-eat buffet, the relationship soured. What once was Bambi quickly became, "Get off my lawn, you 4-legged salad monster!" These days, Bambi is less of a heartwarming Disney icon and more of a garden-devouring menace, a suburban Sasquatch feared by anyone with a hydrangea bush. The shift in deer reputation is one of the greatest PR disasters of the modern age. One day they're cuddling up to rabbits and birds, and the next, they're leading garden destruction as if they're auditioning for a villain role in the next Avengers movie. So what can we do? Can Bambi's image be restored? Or is the deer destined to remain the Darth Vader of backyard horticulture? Only time will tell. Until then, protect your gardens, folks, because while the deer may be cute, they've also turned into the scourge of suburbia. The lesson here? Don't judge a deer by its Disney movie. Thank you, and may your hostas survive the season.
Well, I mean, Peter does make a point. The arc of us, feeling so bad for Bambi to now, really villainizing deer. This has been quite the arc for deer in our modern society.
Well, yeah, but I'm sorry, but if they eat your plants, I have no sympathy for Bambi. I'm sorry. That's where I stand. I said it.
She said it here. Write the letters to Carol. All right, let's see where our expert stands on deer and deer-resistant plants.
Hi everyone, my name is Bonnie Engelhart. I am a landscape designer and consultant, and I also do a little bit of teaching and writing on occasion on all things plants and garden making. I live in southwestern Oregon, really close to the Northern California border and a bit inland from the ocean. We are sort of a pseudo-Mediterranean climate here. Zone 7 in a harsh winter, but most years now it's kind of cusp between zone 7 and 8. We have really hot and dry summers, and often spring and fall are hot and dry as well, but kind of unpredictable anymore what winter and spring will be like. What we also have here in this sort of mix of rural, mountainous area and lots of small towns and cities is a lot of deer. And I'm not talking regular deer. I'm talking like aggro deer, especially in town. They have become really desensitized to humans and will literally stand about 4 feet away from you and look you in the eye while they eat your landscaping. So we have quite a challenge here. I live on the outskirts of town with herds of deer that cross my property daily, multiple times a day. And so I have a ton of experience with what they will and won't eat, how they attack things seasonally, and just the narrowing list of things that we can get away with anymore. I decided to break this topic down into categories the way I would teach it. So talking about the 4 distinct qualities that make a plant deer resistant. So first up is heavily textured foliage. And just a note, this is kind of narrowed down to really hairy plants anymore for us here. So I chose Phlomis russelliana, or hardy Jerusalem sage. Total confession, I am a phlomophile. I know I made that up, but seriously, Phlomis was one of my first big plant crushes, and I have never gotten past it. I love them all. I want them all. I somehow need them all. And there are quite a great many species to collect, although they are not super common in the nursery trade, even here on the West Coast. Phlomis russelliana has a much broader hardiness range than most species, going from zone 5 to 9 and possibly even zone 4 with excellent drainage and maybe some insulation from snow. It's native to Syria and Turkey, and it's really an adaptable plant. It can take full blasting sun all the way into partial shade, which is pretty incredible. This is a rhizomatous growing large-scale ground cover. It has huge leaves, even for a genus full of large-leaved plants. And they grow to about, I'd say, 18 to 24 inches tall, but then the whole plant can get almost 3 to 4 feet tall when in bloom. And it can easily spread 3 to 4 feet wide and even wider with age. I will say that this is one of the easier phlomis to propagate because of that rhizomatous nature. You can really dig up chunks and spread it about or share it with your friends, as opposed to others that need to be propagated by cutting. Back to the foliage. So these huge leaves are a nice medium green on top and paler on the underside, and they are covered with bristly hairs. The stems are also really woolly and quite thick and squared off. The leaves are also a bit quilted and thick in texture and slightly aromatic. All phlomis of my acquaintance have really cool Dr. Seussy flowers comprised of whorls of hooded blooms tightly packed around rigidly upright, thick squared stems, and then they bloom in segments, moving on upward. What sets this species apart, though, is the color. It is the most velvety, delicious, buttery, two-tone yellow, and I absolutely love it. The seed heads are also really cool and hard to want to cut back, although I have found with most big fuzzy-leaved perennials, if you avoid cutting back the seed heads, the foliage kind of suffers, and as soon as you do cut them back, everything rebounds, and so they're great for collecting for autumn bouquets or wreaths, that kind of crafty business. And did I mention how drought tolerant this plant is? It really is tough as nails. It can take a wide range of soil types and moisture levels. Being Mediterranean, that's sort of expected, but still, it is a rock star, and I can't say enough about it. The second and by far most reliable category is aromatic foliage, and for this one I chose Monardella villosa Russian River. This is a western native coming out of northern California and found into southern Oregon. Russian River is a more garden-tolerant selection of the species, and it's also more readily available in the nursery trade, which I don't know about the rest of the country, but on the West Coast, that can be tricky, especially where I live. And, you know, if you can have all these great plants, but if you can't find them and you can't grow them in your garden, then it's a moot point. Anyhow, this species, commonly known as coyote mint, is hardy from zone 6 to 9, so a pretty nice range there. And as the common name would imply, the scent of the foliage on this is a really lovely, spicy mint. It's strong but not overpowering and stinky like some aromatics. This is a fantastic and versatile evergreen shrublet, growing to about 12 to 24 inches tall and up to 2 to 3 feet wide when it's really happy. It can take such a wide range of conditions, everything from intensely hot full sun to quite dappled partial shade, most types of soil and regular water through pretty spare droughty conditions. I will say that the more shade you push it into, the looser the habit, and it kind of grows a little bit like an octopus. But it takes to pruning really well, which can help make it fuller and more dense and less rangy. This is a summer bloomer, which is pretty essential for pollinators, native pollinators in particular. We have such an abundance of spring bloomers, and then it gets a little bit skinnier as we move into the hot months. So this one picks up getting smothered with, I would say, a rich pinky lavender, clusters of flowers. They're really pretty, and they just get flocked to by so many species of butterfly and bees. And they bloom a really long time on their own, and especially if you deadhead, you can really extend the season. And at a certain point in fall, I just leave the seed heads, and if I'm lucky, maybe I'll get some seedlings. And with this plant, that's never an issue for me. The more the merrier. For my poisonous selection, I decided to go with something you wouldn't necessarily think to classify as that, and that is Amsonia hubrichtii, or threadleaf, or Arkansas blue star. This is a prairie native from Arkansas and Oklahoma. Hardy zones 4 to 9. Of course, most prairie natives are super hardy and tough. This beefy perennial will get easily 3 by 3 feet and often wider with age. And so it's the mildly toxic latex sap in the stems that is pretty untasty and unpalatable to deer and critters. In combination with that, the foliage on this particular species of Amsonia is really narrow, long leaves clothing the stems, kind of in a bottle brush style, but not very much there to chomp on, I would say. Would not be very satisfying to eat. But what it does is it creates this amazing texture. The overall feel is very airy and billowy, soft and feathery. You just want to pet it. It's a great substitute for grasses. I often have clients who just do not like ornamental grasses. I know, the shame, but it's true. They're not for everybody. And this, I find, a great substitution to get some of that texture in a planting. And like grasses, this is a perennial that only requires pruning once a year. You let it go, and then once it's dormant in the winter, you can cut it back or leave it till late winter, which is what I do with everything. So really, I mean, it's about as low maintenance as you can get for a perennial, which is awesome. Also, not only that, but you still get flowers. This Amsonia is covered in clusters of the palest blue starry flowers in, I would say, mid-spring. And they're a great nectar source for butterflies. So doubling down on the benefit and the beauty. And then come fall, one of the species' most notable characteristics is the fall color. It's absolutely stunning, especially when it's planted in mass, but also sprinkled around a planting if you don't have room for masses of this. The whole, bright green foliage starts turning shades of yellow into deep gold, and eventually it picks up brassy tones, even burnt orange. It's just absolutely stunning. And very photogenic, I would say. So this perennial can be slow to establish. It takes a little bit of patience, but once it gets there, it's just awesome. And it really is versatile in its conditions that it needs. It can take full sun, it can take part sun, it can take drier, moister, most soil types. I'm sure it wouldn't be thrilled about heavy, sticky clay, but nobody's thrilled about that. So just very useful, very easy care. A lot of bang for your buck on this one. And to round things out, the final category is spiky, pokey, thorny plants. So for this one, I chose Elaeagnus pungens, Hosoba fukurin. This is a more compact selection of variegated silverberry native to China and Japan. Everything about it is a bit smaller than the straight species. It can grow to about 6 feet tall and wide, and the foliage on this one is a bit smaller than average too, with a slightly narrow, elongated leaf that has a rough, puckery kind of texture to it. And the leaf margins are a warm gold when they emerge in spring, aging to a nice creamy tone that just provides an accent in any vignette, a little bit of contrast to regular green foliage, and something to play off of in color combos. Hardy zone 7 to 10. Elaeagnus in general are tough as nails. They just can take almost anything. Really crappy soil, and since they're nitrogen fixing, they kind of handle that. I've had really good luck with this one in heavy clay, where a lot of other shrubs kind of languish. Sun exposure can be anything from full sun to partial sun, and even quite a bit of shade. I found with most variegated Elaeagnus that full, hot, reflected sun can kind of burn their leaves a little bit, and so partial sun's sort of the sweet spot. Like the species and many others of its kind, it's a fall bloomer. The interior of the plant will be cloaked in pendulous ivory flowers. They're not very showy, but they are so fragrant. It's quite heavenly, and the scent carries quite a bit too. And then following that are red berries that the birds love. So fall pollinators have a good food source here. It's a great wildlife plant. And I guess I forgot to mention about the actual thorns. So the entire shrub is covered in extra long, extra numerous thorns, and that's what sets this particular selection apart and makes it really more deer resistant than the species.
All right, Carol, we did it. Another one in the books. We are hurtling towards the end of the gardening season here, and this was a great way to end it, especially talking about plants that hopefully the deer, despite it being a good, bad, or ugly winter, will eat.
That's right. The herds will be hurtling away from our garden.
Oh, it's turned into a pun podcast. All right. All right, thanks for listening, you guys. See you next time.